To use the context API, I'll create a new folder, which you don't have to do, but I want to store my context-related files, my application-wide state-related files in a separate folder, and I'll name the folder store, since this contains my state store for the entire application. And in store, I'll add a new file, which I'll name notification context.js. This file is also up to you though, the file name. Now in here, we want to import from React, and we want to import the create context function, because the goal here is to create a new context for managing our notifications. Now we can provide an initialization object here, which defines the structure of this context. And the context, so this object, which will also be exposed to the different components in our application later, this context should actually have a notification property, let's say, which is null initially, but which eventually will be an object with a title, a message, and a status property, so a nested object. And besides that notification property, I also want to have a method for showing a notification, the show notification method. So a property which holds a function, which initially may be empty, so which isn't doing anything here, because we'll replace it with a different function in a different place anyways. I'm just setting up my base context here to get better auto-completion. So the data here is really just dummy data in the end. Still, I want to have a show notification function, and then let's say also a hide notification function, like this. That could be our context, and with that I'll store it in a constant, the notification context, and I'll then export this notification context here to make it available outside of this file as well, so that we can tap into this context and use this context with the use context React hook in our React components. Now, you know that the context which we create here actually allows us to create a component, a provider component, which we can wrap around the components and their child components that should be able to tap into this context. And therefore, I'll actually change this to an uppercase character here, the N, to make it clear that we can get a component out of this thing here. Now, the goal will be to wrap this overall content here with our context later. So to wrap all these components with our context. However, I don't just want to provide my context like this. Instead, I want to create a separate component which also manages all the context related state. So back in this notification context file in the store folder, I'll not just create the context here and export it. Instead, I'll also create a component in here, the notification context provider component. And this component will return notification context.provider, so this component which we can get out of this context, wrapped around props children. So here I'll wrap it around props children. And I'm doing that so that we can use the notification context provider component to wrap it around other components, which will then automatically have access to all our context. Hence, I'll also export this function, and now it's this notification context provider function which I want to wrap around my components which should have access to this context. And in this case, that's in the _app.js file. I want to wrap basically all that content here with my context. So here we can wrap everything with notification context provider, and make sure that you import notification context provider from this notification context file in the store folder, and then wrap that around all this content, which means that all these components which are wrapped by the provider will be able to utilize our context later. And I'm creating this separate wrapper because this notification context provider function here will not just wrap props children. We wouldn't need it for that if that would be all it's doing. But this function should also manage all the context related state. So here we will work with use, state, and so on to manage the notification state and to create the show and hide notification functions inside of this component. And that's what we'll do as a next step.